We're going to be looking at the story of Abraham and Sarah with him. Now let me remind you of their story in the broader biblical narrative. Many years after God had created and many generations were beginning to unfold, Abraham sort of arrives on the scene. Remember that it is through his lineage that God would start the nation of Israel, the people of God, and it's out of the people of God, down the family line of Abraham, that Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, would come. But we see in his story, early on in Abraham's life, that God calls him specifically. We'll get to that in just a moment. But we're picking up his story in the middle of things where he's beginning to wrestle. What we believe, some struggles of fear, afraid that he's not going to become all that God has called him to become. You'll see it as it begins there in verse 1. Look at it. It says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great.'" By the way, this is not the first time that God has come to Abram. God's come to him before, but this is a little unique. Did you notice how God starts the conversation? It's a little odd here. He says, "Fear not." I mean, of all the things that God could have started off with in his conversation to Abram, why is it that he tells Abraham to not fear? And only then he then begins to say, "Hey, just as a reminder, I have a reward for you." Let me give you a little bit of a backstory to sort of clear things up as to what's happening here. When you go to the beginning of Abram's story, you go back to Genesis chapter 12, and there you find Abraham. He's going about his life. He's a nomad, which means that he travels around from place to place. He's got lots of property, lots of cattle, lots of animals, and so he has to keep them moving. They'll go to a place for a time. He'll set up his tent, and that would become home for a while. The animals would graze on the fresh grass, and then when they've sort of taken advantage of all they could of that area, they would then pick up and go someplace else. Well, God comes to Abraham at one particular point in his life, and he says, "Look," he said, "I want you to leave here. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your family, and I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you." He doesn't tell him where he's going. He says, "I just want you to go." And he says, "If you go," he said, "there I will make you a great nation. Wherever I'm taking you, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those that curse you. And all the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." And we learn that Abraham, with great faith, picked up his belongings, his entire family, and he goes. Eventually, Abraham comes to the land of Canaan. Remember the story of how Lot, his nephew, had gone with him, and both of them had lots of property. Their animals started getting in with one another, created some fights between the two different parts of the family, so they decided they would separate. And Abraham gave Lot the opportunity to go first. You choose. And so Lot chooses the entire valley of the Jordan River. Abraham, meanwhile, he goes westward, and he chooses Canaan as the land that would be his. When he gets there, God says, "Look, I want you to look around. Look at everything that you see. I want you to look to the north. I want you to look to the south. I want you to look to the east. I want you to look to the west. Whatever you see, all of this will be the land that I will give to you and to your offspring forever." God gave this huge promise to them. And then we read this statement in Genesis chapter 13, verse 16. He said then, "I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted." I want you to think about what a mind-blowing dream this is. Up to this point, Abraham is just living life, man. He's taking care of his wife. He's taking care of his servants. He's taking care of all of his belongings. He's taking care of his nephew. His only goal in life, for the most part, was to try to please God, which he definitely tried to do, and just to get through the day. And then God shows up, and God gives him a very specific dream, and tells him, "Listen, you're no ordinary person, because I've chosen you, and through you, because if you will obey me, this world is going to be blessed because of you. You're going to become the father of a great nation. I'm going to give you a land of your very own. You're going to have so many people that are going to be a part of your family line. There is no way for them to be able to count. Nobody could count the number of offspring that is coming your way." I want you to think about what Abraham would have felt like after he received that vision. I mean, life was sort of okay before that, Can you imagine? He's now got a little bit of a hitch in his step, right? He's grooving a little bit, and he's excited because God has a plan and a purpose for him. I mean, imagine walking away from an experience like that where you hear from God and hear Him speaking to you. Talk about being in the groove. There's just one problem to this story. God has said, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a great family that's going to come out of you. The one big problem is he had no children. You see, when Abraham received the first word from God, you know how old he was when God said, hey, I've got this great promise for you? He was 75 years of age. He's no young man at this point. 75. And God is saying, look, your offspring are going to be blessed into eternity. And Abraham is now, many years later, he's sitting on this information. After God gave him this exciting news, you're going to be this great nation. I'm going to bless you greatly. You're going to have all this offspring. Many years later, we now find him in Genesis chapter 15, sitting. He's in his tent. And no doubt, we're not told what's going through his mind. We don't know what he is processing here. But we get the sense that he's not as confident about the future as he once was. Maybe he's lost his groove here. Maybe that's what's prompting the Lord to say to him from the very beginning, fear not. He had such dreams, such big God-given dreams, but a lot of water is now crossed under the bridge. Maybe the dream didn't see it as much as a possibility as it once before. Do you remember those dreams that you once had? I don't want to talk about those kid dreams. You know, after I grew out of my younger years, the dreams that I had were no longer about getting on a rocket ship and blasting into outer space or designing theme park rides, right? But I've had dreams. You've had dreams about having more for your life. More mature dreams of how God may have spoken to you and encouraged you. I'm talking about a God-given dream to live a life of purpose, to make a big impact upon this world, to be whatever God has called you to be. Maybe He's called you to be a pastor like me. Maybe to be a church planter or a missionary somewhere. Maybe it is to start a community mission outreach in this very county. Or maybe God has called you to make an impact into your neighborhood. But, you know, life's got busy, right? You got to get the kids to school. You got a job you got to go to. You got bills that you have to pay. Where are you in that dream? Has the dream faded? Have you not achieved it? Have you lost your groove? I get that's really the sense that's happening in Abram's life when you look at this text here. I mean, you look at it, what is God saying to him? It's not that he's given up on his faith in God, but God is saying to him, look, fear not, I am your shield. It doesn't matter what's in front of you, I'm going to protect you. And then he says, your reward, it will be very great. In other words, he was saying, I will fulfill the promise that I've made to you. How do we know that he's speaking about the fulfillment of that promise? You know, there's a statement in Psalm 137 that talks about children being a reward. Listen to this. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. So Abraham's reward, God is saying, look, you remain true to me. I've made this promise. Your future reward will be descendants coming your way. You're going to have a family line. It just hasn't happened yet. And what we see in Abram's life here is that he's fearing that it's not going to take place. How do we know this? Well, look at the questions that Abram begins to ask. Look on down in verses 2 and 3. Abram says, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And then he sort of seems to be pointing a finger at God when he says in verse 3, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household, one of my servants, in other words, will be my heir. Now remember, Abraham's very successful. He's got lots of property, very wealthy. He and Sarah have everything except one thing. They had no children. It was something that was a deep desire of theirs. They deeply longed for this, especially in their culture. You see, back then, people who were married and never had kids, they were barren, they were childless. It often made people wonder, well, what did you do to make God mad? God is punishing you. That's why you don't have any kids. He's bringing punishment upon you. You've done something wrong. And so for many people back then, if you had no kids, it was a great shame that weighed down upon you to be without children. And yet they knew that God had given them the promise. God said, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to have many offspring. And though God had promised that great level of offspring, God still hasn't come through. I mean, He gave the promise at 75. Now, many years have passed by and still no children. Still they waited. I'm reminded that sometimes we have to wait for the promises of God to be fulfilled. Sometimes He tells us that He leads us to believe that we're going to go to do something and fulfill something, and it doesn't happen in the timing that we expect it to happen. And we struggle with that, but that's the way God works sometimes. But that does not mean that God will not ultimately respond. You see, with Abraham, God doubles down. After Abraham begins to question and show that he's fearful that this promise is not going to come, God doubles down on the promise. Look at verses 4 and 5. It says, behold, the word of the Lord came to him. By the way, let me pause here. When you see that phrase, the word of the Lord comes to a person, that is an indication that that person is a prophet. This is a big deal in Abram's life. It occurs in verse 1. It occurs now again in verse 4. We're reminded that God has selected him, right? So behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And this is what the word said. This man shall not be your heir, this servant, but your very own son shall be your heir. And then notice this, verse 5. He brought him outside and he said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you were able to number them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Much like he said, hey, just like the dust of the earth, you can't count all of the dust, so shall your offspring be. Now he's saying, look up into the stars. As you cannot count all the stars, so shall your offspring be. But it's important, not just what God says to him here. What's important is what God does with Abraham. Did you notice before he showed him the stars, what did he do? What did he do? Look there in verse 5. It says that he brought him outside. I want you to imagine a scene now. God has spoken to Abram while Abram is sitting in his tent. Abram, who's this nomad and packs up and goes from time to time from here to there, has set up this tent. It's not a house like we're used to where we have our 8 and 10 foot ceilings. It's probably about 5 or 6 feet tall, no more than 7 feet tall at its highest point. And Abraham, he is sitting in the tent, and God shows up, and God says, fear not, I am your shield, and your reward is going to be very great. But before he tells him, look up into the stars, look at all the stars, see if you can count them if you can. You won't be able to count them, but so shall your offspring be. Before he tells them that, he says, get up and go out. And he takes him out of the tent so he can actually look up at the stars in the sky. Mind you, this is at a time long before today where we've got all of our street lamps and our city lights, that ambient light that sort of keep us from seeing the stars as clearly as we could here in Ocala. He's out in the wilderness, out in the plain, no ambient light. All he could do is just come out and see all of heaven, the expanse of heaven in all of its glory. And God is speaking to him, I believe, showing him, and now showing you and me that we've got to be careful that nothing man-made, nothing in our mindset that stands in the way of us understanding what God's will is for us. Likewise, that we would not allow our limited vision of God prevent us from trusting God like we could. Chris Spears, come up here for a second.